Hey there, Dean Walker here, host of the Poetry of Predicament podcast. In this episode of the Poetry of Predicament, we'll be speaking with Naresh Giangrande. We spoke with him at the end of 2018 as he was looking forward to the first couple of months of 2019, leading a course, a new course that they had developed over in the slipstream of the long-standing transition movement as it's expressed in Totnes, where he is from. The new course was to include a remarkable new distinction and soon-to-be body of work from Jem Bendell, which starts and is founded on deep adaptation. So their course was named a deep dive into deep adaptation. The new course that they created was considered to be a deep dive into deep adaptation. And they did that course, they produced that course with Jem Bendell. So we'll be hearing a little bit about that. And if you found use in that last conversation with Naresh, I think you're going to find even more value this time. I try to dig as deep as I can with him to just find out from his remarkable body of experience and creativity in this work, what keeps him inspired now. What is his leading edge in terms of his own experience of the process work that seems to be demanded of in these times, and how that's affecting things like transition as a movement, and then with the new inclusion of deep adaptation. I think you'll find it a valuable exploration into not only transition and what it's up to now, but separately what Naresh is up to now and what he sees as possible by inclusion of deep adaptation. So join me in welcoming Naresh Giangrande. I'm Dean Walker, and welcome to the Poetry of Predicament podcast, a podcast for people brave enough to face humanity's challenges and problems, and most importantly, our numerous predicaments. The Poetry of Predicament is a podcast meant to inspire us to bring forth grace, beauty, and connection with the web of life in the face of a predicament-laden world. Join me in welcoming co-founder of Transition Town Totnes, the very first transition town, trainer, facilitator, thought leader, Naresh Giangrande. He brings his lifetime of conscious activism, community building, and heartful facilitation to this conversation about the state of our world, including deep adaptation. All right, I am really, I'm just enchanted to be able to be back with Naresh Giangrande. Naresh, when we talked just a few months ago, I'm embarrassed to say that I had done very little research into your extensive history in really making a difference in offering people tools as we globally are facing demand to transform the human presence on the planet. And so I am thrilled to know more out of our earlier conversation and subsequent research. And also, we talked about in that earlier conversation, you had an upcoming training in the UK that was going to be substantially adjusted or different from earlier programs you may have designed or delivered and so on, or any of the folks in your circles. So, the first thing I'd like to do is just welcome you here and let you know how happy I am that we're talking. And I would appreciate it if you would kind of reintroduce yourself, if you would, because if you're anything like me, even our self-definition is tending to change on a monthly basis as we try and step into functionality in this wacky world. What you're involved with now, and if you could couch somewhere in that reintroduction an update of how did that program go that you did earlier this year, and then we can move on to some other things. So good to see you.
Great, yeah, good to see you, Dean. Thanks for having me here, and I'm really welcome the opportunity to meet up with you again, because I feel like this is an important part of how we come to understand, or how we come to navigate these times, which it's becoming clear to me is going to be increasingly volatile, and we're going to have to get really good at change and really good at letting go of things, and at loss and all that stuff. So I started the Transition Towns movement here in Totnes, where I still live, with Rob Hopkins back in 2005, and that spread all over the world. And there's now transition towns in many different, I think 50 different countries, or maybe more now, and that's been it's been a roller coaster of a journey. I feel that I've stepped away from the transition movement at the moment, just because it felt like a time to reinvigorate myself and examine where I'm going, and where I want to go. And part of what has come into this space of reflection, I guess, is this deep adaptation. And one of the first things I want to say about that is that it kind of caught me by surprise. It surfaced some forms of denial, I guess, in myself that I hadn't experienced before I read that paper. When Jem went down and listed some of that, some of those forms of denial, oh yeah, that's me. That's what I'm doing. I'm doing that one. And it's interesting because the same thing happened to me at the beginning of the Transition Towns movement. I knew about climate change. I was a card-carrying member of Friends of the Earth for many years. I lived in an eco community, permaculture. I was doing all that stuff. But then something suddenly, I'll realize, oh my God, this is happening now, and it's happening here, and it's something we have to deal with now. And then the same thing happened to me reading Jem's paper, where it's almost like, I think, and this is one of my insights from this deep dive that I'll talk a little bit about in a minute, but is that it's really easy to slip into some of those forms of denial, and I think we all do it. I certainly do, and it takes something to kind of catch us at it and realize, oh, that's something that's happening to me now. And reading Jem's paper, I realized, oh yeah, I obviously I know a lot about climate change. I read a lot about climate change, but just the kind of, I realized I was slipping into a format where I was, or a form of denial where I was thinking or I was choosing what I wanted to believe and what I didn't want to believe, and how, I didn't want it to be as bad as some of the papers were saying it was, and that's what I was choosing to believe, and I anyway, like that's what one thing I saw on the deep dive is that we all choose, or what we can handle at a psychological level, so that then creates our beliefs, and then those beliefs create how we act in the world. So the deep dive was, I got together with 3 other people here in Totnes, and together we, me, Tony Spencer, Ruth, and Sophie Banks, we created a structure and a format over 5 days. We wanted to give ourselves and our participants lots of time to dive deeply into this subject of deep adaptation, and that's what that gave us. We felt that this deep dive it needed to be something that was both it conveyed some information, it carried information, but it allowed participants and ourselves to emotionally and also embody, to experience it, what deep adaptation means for us experientially, and to embody it in our bodies as well as our minds. So it was a kind of attempt to create a holistic way of engaging, a holistic format to engage with this fundamental question about, how is climate change going to alter or continue to alter our societies, the way we do things, how we think about ourselves in the world, and ultimately how we, our values, our ethics, and how we act. So that's in a nutshell what those 5 days were about.
Well, it sounds like first, thank you. I appreciate that, that kind of summary of what the deep dive program was about. But it sounded like you opened it up with, you had some surprising self-awareness show up. Can you say just a little bit more about what surprised you, what shifted?
I think it was how denial works, and how easy it is to slip into a pattern of denial, which, if you don't have other people around you helping you to question yourself, then it's just really difficult to see. So, and that was one of the premises of the deep dive, is that, and also the group, that because this deep dive came out of a group. The first thing we did, me and another group of people, is we called together a group of people to say, we've all read Jem's paper, we need time and space to process it together. And doing it together is going to be much more powerful than doing it on our own. So that's what we started to do. And out of that came this idea for this 5-day exploration. And it's, like I said, it's important to do the work together, because we all have blind spots, and we all have places where it's very easy to get into certain patterns of thought, and certain ways of emotionally responding. And obviously, some of the work we did was around uncovering and exploring our emotional response. So we did some Joanna Macy exercises and some other things, which helped us to feel some of what was happening to us.
Well, I think you're already heading into the direction that I've been um, not having been involved with that program at all, but I'm definitely have been in my own process really for 5 years running now of self-exploration, and then also building out my support circles very much in the same vein that you were just describing. Um, what what I've been trying to map out is more about um, what in the States I think we have. Maybe it's the same in the UK. I think we're similar enough cultures that we're in our head, and so we have a very heady and resistant kind of collective demeanor and way of being around facing anything remotely as challenging as what we're talking about. And I particularly have been wanting to kind of explore the inner workings of me, an average person, as I am inclined to perhaps at first be in the realm of either full-on denial, or if I'm a little bit more, I don't know, politically correct or something, I might be in the sort of acceptable, willful ignorant zone. And what I've been discovering is that there are a couple of little distinctions in the neuroscience world that have really opened me up to, so far I'm finding them very, very useful to find what the heck is going to shift me from my comfortable stance, my privileged stance in the willful ignorance zone. And I'm not at all saying that this is what you were describing, how you were describing your own process. I'm just kind of offering you mine, and we can compare notes or something. I want to find out how I can get from that comfortable place of willful ignorance, of being able to choose what I engage with, what I don't, how much reality am I willing to grant existence to, and what constitutes that shift. What shifts inside of me in order to move across, I don't know if it's a threshold or what the right way to describe it is, but bumps me into that obviously uncomfortable zone where I'm beyond my comfort zone. It is no longer cushy or acceptable, or I can look cool and figure I got it kind of going on in that willful ignorance zone. What allows me to bump myself, or what bumps me into the next level of expanding my ability to be present, even when it is what's showing is far more uncomfortable, and stretches my ability to be present in the face of it. I'm sorry that was so wordy. I hope that was kind of a clear, or at least an understandable mapping of some of what I've been looking at. Does any of that spark you to share?
Yeah, no, it's a very good kind of set of questions. What I feel is what it feels like to me. You're asking is about how does change happen? How do we change? And it's something that I've been mulling over and exploring, I guess, in transition and also since for many years. It's sort of how we change individually, how do we change in our communities, and how do we then change our world? And for me, the thing that shifts me um, out of a a will for, like a will for ignorance, like you say, or a comfort zone, is being able to take in new information that I wasn't previously able to access. And the things that make that possible are community, for me, or community, having people around me who I can talk with and explore. It is having the psychological strength to face change and to accept change. There's also something there about how when there's a kind of cognitive dissonance in me starts to open up, and how then I start to pay attention to that dissonance inside me, like the difference between, say, my self-image, or how I think of myself, or how I think of my place in the world, and or my actions, my behavior, and my values, and or how I see myself. And when those things start to diverge, or when the world around me starts to change significantly, then I see that only that invites me into change, into a process of change. And I think that's what, in effect, we were asking people to do on this deep dive. We were giving people information, both about the state of climate science and sort of world we're facing, but also I think just as importantly to attempt to we created some structures where we did some things we call mapping, where we enable people to look at their perspective of the world from where they're sitting, and then invited them to take another perspective. So, I think it's fair to say most people on the workshop were fairly, in a relatively privileged position in the world. Just about everybody lived in the UK and lived fairly comfortable lives. But we invited people to take the position of, well, what is this? What does climate change look like for somebody in sub-Saharan Africa? What does it look like for some of the species that we're wiping out? What does it look like if you're the sea, or you're an animal? How does that change how you view your world and your life, and what needs to happen? And that was, for me, that was a fantastic lesson, that this thing about deep adaptation looks very different from very different perspectives. From our perspective, it's about, what are we going to lose? We're going to lose all these goodies that we've got that have made our lives easier, more comfortable, more pleasurable. But for people who are already in a collapse scenario, or species or other things, the best thing that could happen to them is for this global industrial society to go into reverse, to stop and to go into reverse and to change.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, and those questions about oppression and colonialism, or whatever patriarchy, or things, those are really core questions to this space of deep adaptation, and they're going to be really core questions going forward. So power and privilege, and that is key to us coming to terms with it, to understand that where we occupy, what position we occupy within that system, and how it's going to determine our response.
Got it. Great. Yeah. I'm curious if you might have taken it all, within that program, within the deep dive program that you're describing, did you see people walking away with um, some either clearer notion for themselves or possibly even uh, let me see how simply, I just want to make it a simple question. Did people come out of that deep dive with a similar conclusion that you did about how essential community is as a part of our growing to face this present and future, and what sort of tools, what sort of intentions, what sort of ideas did you hear people talking about that builds out that notion of how important community is? Because I'm with you, and I'm just on how I'm asking the question.
Mm. Well, community is vital. I doubt you'd find anybody who would disagree with that. And some of the things that are happening now as a result of the deep dive are, people have formed communities of practice around different aspects of the deep dive. So there's a group looking at how to approach governments and big business, how to get the billionaires of this world on side, and use their tremendous expertise and resources to solve some of these problems. So there's other groups that are doing very personal journeys around helping people to feel and experience some of the feelings that they're getting from doing this work, and hopefully, and that in itself helps to heal, and it helps to unstop some of the energy that people might be feeling. There's a number of people who had already been, but are now more engaged with this Extinction Rebellion that's happening here in the UK, which for people who are listening who don't know about it, there's this a social movement that's going on. It's a non-violent direct action movement that's happening here in the UK and across many other countries too, where people are taking direct action. There's as I speak, there's a whole direct action process going on, mostly in London. We've done some here in Totnes, where roads are being blocked, bridges are being blocked in London, and people are getting arrested because they're sort of taking a page out of the playbook of nonviolent direct action movements like civil rights movement, for instance, and others, kind of very Gandhian process of change, as a way to start to build the thing that's most missing, which is the political will to change.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. Naresh, I think you mentioned earlier in the call that you're less involved with transition now, and I'm curious, just from your personal perspective, whether it's with transition or not, just including that history. I'm wondering if you could say what you're seeing in terms of how do we best get this message out, these tools out, this shared experience out, so that people who are not familiar with transition or not familiar with deep adaptation can be introduced and included, and then move forward with others in a good way. I'll just, briefly about myself and the body of work that I'm working on is obviously now a combination of online and usually, as whenever possible, streaming content and meetings that people can interact with one another, at least in an online fashion. And then a blend of that with on demand, still video content, but no interaction. And then lastly, but I just don't see it ever shifting from its number one position, which is live, in-person, support groups meeting together and so on. I'm wondering if you could say anything about how you've seen those proportions of the proportional use of each of those types of learning or meeting. And if there's anything I left out that you see that is also useful, would you mention that?
I think what you're doing is great, providing people with ways to engage in their own time and their own space, and that's what a lot of people do now. And I think you're right. There is a I don't know. I struggle to say the word hierarchy, but there is a difference between something that you do face to face, in a group, say, and something that you do on your own, reading or online or whatever. There's just a different level of transmission that happens. Mm-hmm. That's just how we are as human beings, and no matter how good the technology gets, and who knows, maybe if it gets even better, maybe that will come across. But there is a different level of transmission, and there's nothing. It's a bit like, there's a lot of conferences now which are virtual. You can attend them virtually and watch the sessions and all that. But as anybody who's been to a conference knows, it's usually during the coffee break when you're standing there one-to-one at the coffee bar, sipping your morning coffee, and just somebody sidles up and you start talking. Those are often the most interesting and important conversations you've had during the conference. So it's that's just part of life, I guess. And then, the kind of structured, skilled ways in which people have evolved to create workshops and very specific processes to enable people to both heal and engage with their own process about this work I think is really important too.
Yeah. Well, if you don't mind, I'd love to shift gears just a little bit, and ask you just on a personal level, what is showing up on your screen these days, in your heart these days, that most disturbs you, that most gets your attention, in terms of, sometimes how I say it to myself is, I just have a hard time holding this one if it's if it's just too big, or it's too, in the US's case, just too mind exploding that this is actually happening. I'm curious, what's got your attention these days?
Okay, so as always, in my experience in our world, there's both amazing, fantastic things happening, and there's things that are just like thinking, oh my God, I can't believe this is going in the wrong direction. So there's both amazing and heart-rendering things happening in our world. And here in the UK, there seems to be a lot of people waking up in ways that they hadn't before. I think I sent you that interview I did about deep adaptation on Radio 5, on BBC Radio 5. It's the morning breakfast show. I don't know how many million people listen to it, but it's a national radio program. And if you had told me a year before I was going to be talking about deep adaptation, I probably wouldn't know what you're talking about, but to be talking about it live on national radio and with interviewers that were totally on board with the program. It wasn't like, oh, well, we're going to have somebody representing this whole, environmental thing, and then somebody else, saying, oh, no, there's nothing wrong. We just have to carry on. None of that. It was just, all it was how bad is it? Tell us what to do. What do we need to do now? Where do we need to go? What are some of the ways in which we can, individuals can solve it? What do we need to do at a political level? It was, and the whole program, the whole breakfast program for 3 hours was all about climate change. They had people from the Extinction Rebellion. They had people from various different academics. They had people who written books about, it was just nonstop, and it was. And here it was in something that's in the mainstream culture. So this is interspersed with the sports news, with the weather, with the traffic reports, with it's like, here it is, normal life. It's suddenly, bam, climate change, deep adaptation is landing inside the mainstream culture in a way that I've never seen happen before. So that's exciting. Whether that's going to continue and whether that's going to lead to the level of change. I mean, the thing that just deeply disturbs me is the more I have experienced change and attempting to create change, the more I realize that it is actually, we have incredibly resilient structures in our society that are very difficult to change. And in some ways they're made that way. And that is, it's scary to think about the level of change, and, not just in terms of what we need to do, but creating the political will and enabling that change to happen, and where we are now, as to where we, where it would be ideally where we should be. We're just so far behind, and so little of what needs to happen has happened already. It's deeply disturbing. And the things that get me about my children and my grandchildren. I have two grandchildren who are under a year old, and what kind of world are they going to be living in, in 10 years' time, let alone 20 or 30. So, I see the ability, the climate protests, the school strikes, the ability to organize across national boundaries, the ability of information to spread so quickly, and the progressive end of movements are using that extremely well, but so are the fascist elements of society. They're also using those forms and formats, and so we're seeing all that shift and change very rapidly.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. Again, just a shift of gears, if you don't mind, I can't help but notice, particularly, it's the UK. You guys are just putting out good stuff recently, with both Extinction Rebellion and deep adaptation. At the center of both of those, just those terms, it seems like just using the terms is a transformational tool. To say Extinction Rebellion means you're saying the word extinction, which, whether we include human beings in that, or someone's still wanting to drag their feet in that way or whatever, saying the word extinction shifts us in the conversation. There's no way to say it without consciously or unconsciously rattling a number of our inner constructs. And frankly, deep adaptation does the same in a subtler way, because anyone who takes the time to read Jem's paper, the initial one, and then obviously everything that comes out of it, for me, the crux is the use of the word collapse. and both the word extinction and the word collapse imply, again, that is the kind of term that goes right to our existential core. You know, as how we see ourselves as human beings and a presence on the planet, particularly in the USA. We have hubris just running through every cell of our body in the USA. And to say the word extinction or say the word collapse implies immediately the failure of humanity. And so I'm not trying to take this to an extreme in this conversation. I'm just wondering if my mentioning the transformational nature of using the word collapse or the word extinction, if you've seen anything that around that in your own experience, or you're working with other people in workshop settings or in conversation. Could you say anything about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. The terms deep adaptation, and when people take the time to understand what that means, and that we are in a deep, very deep change process, that whether we like it or not, or collapse, it is it's a challenge. But bear in mind, it's a challenge. It's not a challenge. It's not a failure of humanity. It's a failure of this one particular way of living that we've evolved. It's a very powerful way of living, and it's taken over the whole globe. I mean, I like to call it the industrial growth society. It's not particularly capitalism. It's not particularly communism or socialism. It is a particular organization and way of living that relies on industrial processes and growth at its heart, because of the readily available energy of fossil fuels in particular, and the implied change that means to that form of living. Mm-hmm. So we're only talking, if you take the deep, the incredible span of human life on the planet. We've existed for 99.9% of the time without the industrial growth society. Mm-hmm. And there have been, who knows, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of ways of living. So it's just one form of living. That's the problem. So for me, that gives me hope, because we've created that. We can uncreate it, and we can use all the creativity. It's something we've said in the transition many times. We can use all that creativity into creating this high energy lifestyle, which is unfortunately destroying our ecosystems, to create something that is a low energy lifestyle that regenerates our ecosystems. We understand what those processes are. We need more prototypes. We need more work to understand how to put those into practice in different parts of the world, and in both the diversity and complexity of how that needs to be created. But nonetheless, we have a certain sense of what needs to happen. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And we have the science, we have the way of measuring to know whether we're achieving that, which we're not at the moment, but we could do. So, yeah.
Okay. There's one other kind of stubborn little point that I can't quite tease apart. I can't. I've been looking for a way in to understand human nature, or current human nature, a bit better. I'm noticing that no matter which poll I'm reading, and this is for the past 5 years running, and there isn't really much before that in terms of climate change in particular. But the statistics are at least 2/3 of Americans who are asked um, don't have conversations of consequence, even with their closest inner circle, most intimate, family and spouse and so on. Conversations of consequence that can include um, vitally important uh, political things or health things or climate change or, clearly important issues. Um, and for 2/3 or more people to never have those conversations, so a sizable amount more um, having them extraordinarily rarely. I can't help but wonder, how do we make inroads into that? And is that your experience of people in the UK as well? Something must be shifting, because just for Extinction Rebellion to be at the level that it is, not to mention all the programs that have gone on before, transition and so on. I'm wondering if you have a different view of people's apparent reluctance to talk with one another in a significant way.
Mm.
I wonder if it shows up as
it's extremely difficult to make any kind of generalizations, because one of the things which I will forever I will forever feel blessed by was the fact that Sophie Banks and I went around the world training people in giving transition trainings, and in the process of which we met fantastic people in the United States, as well as Canada, as well as all sorts of other parts of the world, who were already before transition doing amazing work, often as kind of lone voices in the wilderness, and now found a home where they could come together with others and start to create the sort of world they wanted. So it's very hard for me to make that generalization, because I've sat up late into the night with folks in the US talking about some of our deepest hopes and fears, and everything in between, about life, and that's and I do that on a regular basis with people here in the world I know, and I know, I probably live in a bubble. I live in a world where there's a lot of people around here where I know the people in my community. It's sometimes it takes me half an hour to walk from one end of Totnes High Street to the other, which it should be 5 minutes, but it takes, because you just stop and you chat and you talk, and it's an important part of my life to share deeply with people around me, and I think everybody needs that. What's life for if you're not going to engage with the sorts of questions that have always engaged us as human beings? Who am I? What am I here for? What's the meaning of life? What's love? What is peace? And how do you create that in our society, and our lives? There's a whole movement of peacemaking that's coming out of the Haudenosaunee Nation in America, which has its roots in the indigenous culture of North America, which has deeply, deeply influenced a lot of folks here in the UK. I see a lot of people around the world returning to some of the indigenous roots of their land, and um, and uh, reinvigorating those sorts of connections and those sorts of ways of being, um, not in an attempt to recreate what once was or what we think once was, but to find those structures, which in some cases, in some cultures, are still alive, of creating peaceful cultures, in which some of those, the human qualities, which we all yearn for,
Mm-hmm.
connection and love and peace, and who doesn't want that in their life? We all want that, and unfortunately, we live in a culture um, which distracts us all the time from living what's really important.
Yeah. Well, I can appreciate what you're saying, and I guess I just, yes, I have plenty of folks I can bump into in my local walk down the street, but I also am uncomfortably aware of the number of people around me that really, they don't want to talk about the things that you've just been saying. I want to talk about those things. I'm used to talking about those things with my circles of friends and associates and so on. Thank goodness. And I guess my question is really kind of on the edge of our comfort edge there of, who do I not already know? Who doesn't think like me? Who doesn't have a political stance like me? And how might we find a way to have a conversation about what matters most to each of us, share that in a way that is not abusive, is not polarizing, and in fact creates a bit more understanding in a very, very basic way. I'm not trying to suggest some panacea, but that's really where my attention is. Just at the most basic level, how do we expand our ability to reach out and connect with other people and share in such a way that, in my vulnerability, in my modest offering to them of, hi, we've talked from time to time. I'd like to tell you a little bit more about myself, and here's here's an appropriate amount of, just my.
Well, I think there are people who do want to listen. I know somebody, a friend of mine in the States, who she is a member of a coffee morning that meets some on the weekend, somewhere, and it's a deliberate. The construct is across the political divide. So it's people who would identify as, say, Republicans, other people sort of identify as, say, Democrats, or or progressives, or whatever. And they do, the construct is, we meet up and we find ways to talk to each other and to try to understand, not in the sense of, I'm going to convince you that I'm right, you're going to convince me, it's just a way of meeting that enables us to find ways of talking to each other. And that's what's really important. I mean, one of the things that has come out of the whole Brexit fiasco, which interestingly some of the mainstream politicians are now pushing, is this idea of a citizens' assembly.
Yeah.
Which they employed in Ireland before the referendum about whether to change the constitution to allow abortion. And I think that's a fascinating. It sounds like a fascinating process, and I feel we need one here in England, in the UK, about the whole Brexit thing.
Yeah.
And I think there's questions about climate change and how we start to, as a society, change our way of life in order to ensure a livable planet, creating some kind of thing like that would also be truly fascinating, because it allows people of, like you say, of different different cultures, different ideas to meet together and hear some, hear expert opinions, expert witnesses, and then to talk together and to listen to each other. It's it's deeply, deeply needed. Mm.
I'm hoping that that the UK will blaze trails for us, because the US we're way behind y'all. I just I'm starved for more action along the lines of Extinction Rebellion and their inclusion of the Citizens Assembly. It's just so inspiring, so exciting, and God, we need that. Our structures, our governmental structures are well, have clearly collapsed. They are deeply ineffectual. So,
well, it's the same here. I mean, I mean that's something that I think people are beginning to wake up to. Is that is Brexit has demonstrated to everyone that our political system is dysfunctional. It can't, here's a problem. It can't solve it, and as yet, there's no way out.
mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah.
People are starting to come up with ideas, like I said, which is something, but we're nowhere near there yet.
Yeah.
Mm.
Well, Naresh, I can feel the window of this this time together closing, and I'm wondering if you would just do me a favor, and that is, if you just had a couple of minutes to summarize what you've seen, and particularly what's inspired you and moved you and expanded you in these past few months, and you could offer it to folks who are very interested in perhaps not advice, but to hear what's working, what's suggested from someone who's really doing the work, really out there, trying new things, collaborating at a new level. Would you just summarize some of those pieces of your experience from the past few months for us? Kind of like, what would you recommend? Or what have you seen that's working?
Gosh, there is still so much work that is being done on the ground. One of the things that came out of the deep dive was we need transition on steroids, and that process of building resilience. It feels like now's the time when that's happening, and like I said, Extinction Rebellion is bubbling here in a way that it never has done before. With the, I wouldn't exactly say the cooperation, but it's clear. It was clear. I was talking to some mates who were on the bridges who were getting arrested, and they said it was clear that police, a lot of them, agreed with what they were doing, didn't really want to be there arresting them. Talking to the police commissioner for the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Cressida Dick, who's she's a woman. She's brought a whole different format of policing to London. And from some of her interviews, again, it's clear that the interviewers pressing her to say, oh yeah, we're going to really come down hard on these protesters. And she just really didn't want to say that. So there's something that is shifting, at least here in the UK, and I think quite possibly across Europe. I'm really looking forward to how the young people are taking on board this question of their future. and I feel deeply ashamed to be part of the generation that has failed them, and I'm doing my best to change that. And but it's their future, and I feel that energy is going to create a massive movement of change. And I see institutions in Great Britain shifting. The governor of the Bank of England, along with a whole slew of other governors of their national banks, so the Banque de France, the Bank of the Netherlands, I can't remember all of them, but I think there's about 16 governors, the equivalent of the governor of the Bank of England, who have come together to question how are we going to have to change our financial system, and what can we do as governors of national banks. They've formed an association which are now starting to put out press releases. So things are changing and moving. As to what individuals can do, I think for me it's now coming down to we need to shift the political discourse in whatever way works, and so far Extinction Rebellion and that sort of nonviolent direct action seems to be the best way. And I've got a feeling, I've just got a hunch that something is going to really shift in that space, and nonviolent direct action is going to be something. It's going to be changed, or it's going to emerge in a different format, and alongside the individual changes that we can make to our own lives. Because if we're not beacons of light ourselves, the people of us that are living a life that is full of light, and that is living lightly on the planet, and for me that's one of the best things that I can do, is to live my principles and show that to others who, not in the sense of, oh, look at me. It's just like, I'm just living that way. And when people look at me and they see how I live, they go, oh, okay, he walks his talk. He lives how he wants to live. And, and I'm not perfect. And I embody all the contradictions of the industrial growth society. It's inside of me. The baddies aren't out there, and I'm the goodie. I'm part of the problem. And I'm also part of the solution, and so is everybody. And we all have that choice to make about which of those that we want to encourage in ourselves and in our lives and in the people around us, and which we want to have less of. So that's for me, that's the message.
Well, Naresh Giangrande, I just consider myself so lucky every time we get to touch in. You are obviously extraordinarily engaged at a level that I wish we could clone you times a billion or two, bringing forth so much heart and soul in the midst of what has clearly been a very practical track that you've been on, creating the programs that you've been so instrumental in creating. Thank you so much for what you keep bringing to these conversations, and undoubtedly to the people in your life and in your community, and to us here on this little podcast. Really a pleasure to speak with you, and thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure, Dean, and thank you for the work you're doing. And I look forward to talking with you again in the not too distant future.
Me too. Maybe we get to be in the same room at the same time sometime soon.
That would be really nice. Take care.
Take care of yourself.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for watching another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, produced by Dean Walker and the Living Resilience Alliance, www.livingresilience.net. Music today from Michael Hedges, as always, and also Port Blue Into the Sea. Also available on our website, www.livingresilience.net, is a wide array of articles, online learning series, arranging group and individual resilience coaching, and sign up for our every other Tuesday free support group that we call Safe Circle Calls.